Hello! Today I'd like to make a slight change from my usual discussions, and instead I want to talk about boxing, and specifically what many boxing fans consider to be the glaring absence of a boxing title from the current crop of game consoles. I want to talk about the inherent issues in boxing that perhaps prevent this from happening, and I also want to look at the current state of boxing, and why there's never been a better time to get a game published. Indeed, it's been a little over 2 years to the day since I posted an episode lamenting what is fast becoming a decade since the last instalment of the Fight Night series, but I feel the prospect of a boxing game warrants discussion today, owing to both recent rumours on the subject from high flyers in the industry, and also the huge paradigm shift and incremental mainstream revival of the sport that's been occurring in the past couple of months and years, and I'll proceed to break that down today. So, first and foremost, let's consider the shifting landscape of the boxing business and how the current crop of elite-level fighters are breathing fresh life into the sport on a global scale. And kicking off with the glamour division of the heavyweights, this is perhaps the most important division to consider, as it's generally the one that people beyond dedicated boxing fans are aware of. And indeed, looking at the household names of the sport, Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis and so on, we are dealing primarily with heavyweights, and it's only really Floyd Mayweather in recent years who has inched into popular consciousness outside of the remit of heavyweight boxing. Beyond this, maybe some are aware of the Four Kings middleweight era of the 1980s. Maybe some know the name Sugar Ray Robinson, because he's widely regarded as the greatest boxer ever. But generally, it is the heavyweights who prevail with the general public when they think about boxing. And if we look at video games specifically, the aforementioned boxers are the ones that, sell video games and, are on the cover of video games, whether it's 1987's Mike Tyson's Punch-Out for the NES or the Fight Night series of more recent years. So, since about 2015, heavyweight boxing has gained some traction after a decade of the belts being tied up between the Ukrainian Klitschko brothers. And these two were essentially wiping out everyone in the division, fighting predominantly in Germany, and quite rightfully, I think, refusing to fight one another to create an undisputed title holder. In 2015, Britain's Tyson Fury upset the apple cart by defeating Vladimir Klitschko, claiming most of the belts in the process, and then he immediately went off the rails, kind of quit boxing and vacated the belts, which is where it gets interesting, because the belts then became dispersed, among, the next generation of heavyweight boxers, essentially, waiting to be claimed. In similar fashion, the WBC belt, which was vacated by Vitaly Klitschko upon his retirement, kind of floated around, was briefly held by Bermane Stiverne, before it was claimed in epic fashion by the seemingly unstoppable force today of America's Deontay Wilder. So, from about 2016 onwards, we've seen heavyweight boxing getting interesting, and more importantly, it's been building a global appeal once again, with various boxers entering championship contention, with veterans such as Cuba's Luis Ortiz, Bulgaria's Kubrat Pulev, Russia's Alexander Povetkin, and the young up-and-comers such as New Zealand's Joseph Parker, the Mexican-American Andy Ruiz, Dillian White from Britain, Filip Hrgovic from Croatia, and so on. I'm not going to list everyone, but there's a healthy crop of fighters from all over the world that are kind of entering gatekeeper elite level status today. But what is really propelling things forward and driving attention towards the sport is this triumvirate of current champions and elite level fighters. The aforementioned American, Deontay Wilder, who is the WBC champion. We have the British world champion, Anthony Joshua, and the recently returned former champion and self-proclaimed Gypsy King, Tyson Fury. And these three guys between them have in many ways crystallised the excitement and the anticipation of this generation of heavyweight boxing, owing to their wildly different personalities, their wildly different fighting styles, their stellar records and their personal narratives and contention with one another within the sport. So Deontay Wilder is this unorthodox knockout artist who has cut a path through the division by just starching everyone put in front of him. Tyson Fury is a master technician and a consummate boxer who's come back from a suicidal depression to campaign once more at championship level. And Anthony Joshua is, for many, particularly in the UK, considered the golden boy of the heavyweights. As an Olympic gold medalist, he's a good-looking guy, infinitely marketable, his face is everywhere. And he's also an exciting fighter to watch as well, owing to his ability to kind of walk through top 10 opponents, but also display a certain fallibility at times, which, makes all of his fights quite interesting to watch, because you're never really sure where they're going to go, and they're quite often 50-50 fights. Particularly since losing the belts to Andy Ruiz and then claiming them back, which shows this certain fallibility about him. So these three guys have been seeing off the aforementioned contenders and building hype around themselves for the past 18 months to 2 years. And we are reaching a fever pitch with the desire to see these guys finally face one another. And indeed, at the time of this recording, Fury has already fought Wilder once to a draw, and their rematch is imminent, and who knows what's going to happen there. But regardless of what happens, it's assumed that whoever emerges victorious from that fight will be set to face Anthony Joshua. So, hopefully we're seeing this kind of triumvirate finally kind of culminate and start fighting one another. And returning to the concept of a boxing game, this is precisely why we should be seeing one emerging around now. We have three exciting heavyweight fighters in their prime, all set to face one another over the next 18 months or so, and this alone will sell a game by itself. And although, the end of February, Wilder or Fury is going to take a loss against one another, I don't think it's going to dent their marketability or their reputation too much, depending on the nature of the loss, I suppose. But having said that, boxing is a very time-dependent sport, and successive losses and the natural deterioration of a fighter who, let's face it, has an average of 10 years, shall we say, of good condition, it's actually a pretty narrow window of opportunity to usher the sport back into the mainstream, and particularly into the arena of video gaming, because, we need someone to hang the game on, someone to go on the cover, and, people are going to pick it up. So the prevailing hype wave of the Wilder Fury Joshua triad should be taken full advantage of right now, and is fertile ground for a boxing video game, in my opinion. Now, of course, the heavyweights are not the be-all and the end-all of boxing, and returning to the growing global intrigue of the sport within the other weight categories, we have Japan's Naoya Inoue, who is a freak of nature, with this ability to knock out basically everyone, although he's a bantamweight, standing at 5'5". We have Mexico's Canelo Alvarez, who, despite being a middleweight, arguably rivals Wilder's popularity in America and Mexico. We have the Ukrainian Vasily Lomachenko, and we have the American Terence Crawford. And all of these guys are kind of superior boxers fighting at elite level across various weight categories. And also, we have the up-and-comers and the new generation. My personal favourite is Scotland's Tartan Tornado Josh Taylor, who is currently campaigning at super lightweight. And he's going to explode onto the scene soon, I think, because he's set to make his US debut this year. So these are all guys to watch and are making waves in the sport in their respective weight divisions, with little or no losses to their names so far. But beyond even this, boxing awareness has also grown by taking a very unexpected and somewhat controversial turn in recent years by accommodating YouTube celebrities on professional boxing cards, with the most prominent to date being the KSI and the Logan Paul card. Now, this is an interesting development that can be looked at from multiple perspectives, from a boxing perspective. On the one hand, many boxing fans find the prospect of YouTube boxing, and particularly YouTubers headlining professional cards, somewhat absurd. And indeed, professional boxers by tradition and the harshness of the sport have had to graft from very hard and humble beginnings, in a lot of cases. And it's a struggle to even luck out and get on television, let alone make any serious money from the sport. And on the flip side, one of the great appeals of boxing is the narratives of these guys who have come from nothing and, they've achieved world championship glory. And I always remember my dad, I got into boxing through my dad, and he used to show me VHS tapes of, the great fights like Hagler-Hearns and whatnot when I was a kid. But I always remember he showed me a fight of the Ghanaian boxer Azuma Nelson, probably one of the best African boxers who ever lived, one of my dad's favourite boxers. And in a post-fight interview after defending his world title, he's holding this tiny little Ghanaian flag, kind of shouting, "This is my country, I'm so proud, I'm proud of Africa, I'm proud of my country." And like, you can feel his passion, and it's just another of these great things about boxing where, Nelson has come from, a really harsh upbringing in a very poor country, and he's gone on to achieve wealth, fame and glory through the sport of boxing. So, it's this whole narrative thing, and guys like Azuma Nelson have earned the spotlight in every way. So the argument from the boxing fans' angle is that, the YouTube guys haven't worked and earned the right to kind of, have the spotlight, as it were, in remotely the same way as most other boxers. So that's the argument against. On the other hand, there is the argument that the YouTube fights have brought a whole new young generation of fans to the sport, which is undoubted. If the promoters are to be believed, of the people that are buying, the PPV for these cards, then yeah, absolutely, it's bringing new fans to the sport, and arguably fans are what boxing has needed for a very long time, owing to the popularity of the UFC, as a combat sport, and a range of other things that I'll touch on shortly. So ultimately, perhaps the YouTube thing can be considered a good thing because it's bridging boxing with the YouTube generation and the younger generation. And these guys will go on to discover the likes of Lomachenko, Terence Crawford, Alexander Usyk, and so on, and really, hopefully develop an intrigue and passion for the sport, which is great for everyone. And looping back round to the purpose of this video and why I'm talking about the YouTube generation and the YouTube boxing is because there tends to be a correlation, and particularly people that are interested in KSI and whatnot, there will be an overlap with people that are interested in video games, so if people are getting into boxing by watching KSI and Logan Paul fight and they're also interested in video games, it just makes perfect sense at this point in time to produce a video game that is going to appeal to these guys, thus is going to, by extension, build the appeal of boxing. So it makes perfect sense, in the midst of all this YouTube stuff, that we should be seeing a video game getting made. Now, on the note of the social media stardom thing, it's worth noting that even promoters themselves are these days firmly in the spotlight, accountable for their actions, and indulging publicly in conflict and banter with disruptor personalities such as Eddie Hearn, Carly Sauerland, Floyd Mayweather, being featured alongside veterans such as Frank Warren, Bob Arum, and so on. And this advent of YouTube broadcasting and YouTube interviews and the Twitter wars that they have has led to scenarios that transcend even the fighters and the sport itself. And indeed, I walked past a colleague's laptop a few weeks ago and they were watching a compilation of amusing Eddie Hearn quotes, and I asked him if he liked boxing, and he was just completely unaware that this guy was a boxing promoter. So it shows that the kind of development, the advent of YouTube and memes and whatnot is kind of building appeal towards these things, So this is all fine and well, and I think the current crop of boxers, the attention drawn by YouTube, and the larger-than-life promoters and personalities, all of the stuff I've mentioned builds a solid case for a boxing game, in my opinion. And the necessity of putting out a new video game will not only define this fresh generation of fans and fighters, but it's also going to help build appeal because, some people will just buy a video game because it looks cool. I don't know anything about cars, and I'm crap at driving, and I don't know any of the makes or models or whatever, but I just tend to buy Gran Turismo games sometimes because they look awesome and I want to drive around a circuit. There's completely irrational things like that will certainly transfer over to boxing. Maybe someone gets tired of playing Tekken all the time or UFC all the time. They'll pick up a boxing game. So this is all interesting to consider, but now let's take a look at the crap side of boxing, which probably accounts for or contributes to the reason that we haven't seen a video game in almost a decade. And this is equally interesting to consider because boxing is unlike any other sport, and honestly, it's probably the most frustrating sport in the world to be a fan of, speaking as someone who's followed it for most of my life. And indeed, the promoter Lou DiBella recently said in an interview, boxing is a self-defeating sport. And I think that's such a spot-on quote and observation, because boxing is first and foremost a business that has conflicting promoters with allegiances to conflicting broadcasters and pay-per-view business models and whatnot. And on top of this, there's like 4 main sanctioning bodies who kind of have the belts and the rankings. And thus there's 4 world championship belts per division, which makes it really hard to sort of define one figure as the face of boxing and the best of the best, unless they unify or become undisputed, like the Klitschko's. Lennox Lewis has done it, Anthony Joshua has done it, and this is really hard to do because each sanctioning body requires belt holders to face mandatory challenges or risk losing the belt, combined with promoters, being petty and not allowing their champions to face one another, and so on. So unless you really have a personality that transcends the sport, such as Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson, it's naturally very hard for the everyman on the street to engage with the sport, because, why would they bother researching and finding out about all the sanctioning bodies and whatnot? And so, because it's comparatively less straightforward than other sports, they don't really care, and they'll go and watch something straightforward like football or basketball, where if my team beats your team, we progress onward through the tournament and face, the other winners, up until someone wins a trophy or whatnot, which is much more simple and straightforward than professional boxing. And on the note of other sports, another argument has been made that boxing's decline is also in part to the fact that there's so much competition out there, and particularly, American markets and in America, because over there, boxing has a lot more competition when you have people watching baseball or basketball or football or hockey, wrestling, NASCAR, not to mention the UFC. There's just so many sports that are prevalent all throughout America. Whereas in the UK, for example, Europe as well, I suppose, it's basically football or soccer, depending where you're from. Football, occasionally rugby, occasionally cricket, and then boxing. And that's basically it, and tennis, and, that's it. That's basically our sport. Although we do have some outliers such as speedway, which is pretty cool. And we have ice hockey, but, it's nowhere near on the level as it is in America. So anyway, moving on. Regarding video games, the fractured nature of boxing, along with promotional management, governing bodies, all of this fractured stuff, it makes you wonder how they get anything done, let alone a video game. And to be honest, I'm not sure how much stake promoters have in a game being made, but it would certainly be a certain amount. And this draws me on to my final point regarding recent rumours over the past 18 months or so, which is that both Matchroom promoter Eddie Hearn and also Mayweather Promotions promoter Floyd Mayweather have both said that they are interested in getting a boxing game made. And this begs the question of whether a pan-promotional or management agreement can take place to get these boxers' likenesses and, licensed, to get a video game in the works. Are there going to be petty arguments about whether Deontay Wilder, Tyson Fury or Anthony Joshua features prominently, on the marketing campaigns or the cover or whatever? Or indeed, would we be looking at a game that would be confined only to promotional stables, and maybe some of these guys can reach an agreement where others can't? So we might see a Golden Boy and Matchroom game, or a pan broadcast-led DAZN game, for example, which I think would kind of suck, because although the likes of DAZN and even the Sauerland brothers, with the World Boxing Super Series, they've really succeeded in a sort of cross-promotional platform for fighters, they would regardless still be omitting certain significant boxers if it's only confined to their stables, and ones who haven't entered these deals. So, yeah, it's a very complicated subject. I'm going to wrap up now because I feel like I'm just beginning to rant. But the good news is that a need for a boxing video game has been acknowledged by many people, including the high-flying promoters, who have a lot of skin in the game and a lot of influence in the game. Floyd Mayweather and Eddie Hearn are both major players in the sport, and it just remains to be seen whether these guys have the influence, with both their fighters and management companies and so on, and the ability to agree among themselves about a unifying game title, or whether, like all other aspects of boxing, from sanctioning bodies to drug testing agencies, everybody's going to want to do their own thing, at the expense of the fans. So that about wraps it up. Boxing games are being discussed and, are desperately needed, but the business needs to strike while the iron is hot. As I've said, YouTube fights, undefeated boxers, this isn't going to last forever. The whole AJ Fury Wilder thing, it's not going to last forever. YouTube boxing isn't going to last forever. And if anything's going to get done, it basically needs to be now.